Arjun, I'm excited to chat with you more in detail, man. I love what you're working on. You've been doing this since 2017, I believe. In your words, how do you briefly describe the current trajectory of Connext? What the organization is trying to accomplish in the world?
Awesome. Yeah. Thanks for having me. And I'm really excited to be here. So Connext is at the highest level, Connext is trying to build a way for blockchains to communicate with each other. Like our vision of the future is that blockchains don't scale intrinsically, and this is something that people have been talking about since 2017, pretty much since we started Connext. And what we've found over time is that the best way to kind of scale out blockchain-based ecosystems is to kind of scale them horizontally, like you would with servers. You just like add more kind of scale, like chain-like environments in parallel. There's a little bit more complexity to that, but like what it looks like to the user is like interacting with many chains in parallel. Now, of course, this creates this like big user experience hurdle of I am on XYZ chain and have funds in a wallet there, and I want to go interact with an application on another chain. How do I do that? And then even beyond that, like the concept of needing to think consciously about like I'm here and I need to go here is itself just such a huge hurdle for people. So what we want to do is create a world where users don't ever really need to know or care what chains they're on, and B, developers can actually build applications that similar to web applications today, like pull resources from different places simultaneously. Applications that are natively cross-chain. They are natively built to interact with pools of liquidity in multiple ecosystems all at once.
I'm sorry, classic mute mistake. When you say running on multiple chains, do you mean that to be within one crypto, or would you say layer one, like multiple chains? Does it make sense to say multiple chains within a layer one, or is this? Help me understand that a little bit better.
That's a good question. That's a really good question. And it's a good question because things have gotten like really messy lately in the sense that like it's, that we previously had this very clear taxonomy of like there was like Bitcoin and then there was like Ethereum. There was a bunch of other stuff that like none of that really had a lot of traction. And so Ethereum was a layer one, and then everybody was thinking, okay, let's scale Ethereum out by building layer twos, like scalability solutions on top of Ethereum that are like directly tied with the Ethereum ecosystem in some way. And in theory, layer two solutions are supposed to also like always have like basically rely on their layer one for security. Now, of course, those do exist now. Those are called rollups, and rollups are like a fantastic mechanism to solve the scalability issue. But what we've also seen is that like you've had the proliferation of like EVM, Ethereum compatible sidechains like Polygon and I guess BSC technically is that. And then you have other Ethereum compatible layer ones like Avalanche. And then you have this like even newer, more interesting phenomenon where you have a bunch of other ecosystems that are not EVM compatible, like Polkadot and Cosmos, and even Solana, and Near, where they have built their own like EVM chains that act as sort of like a gateway between Ethereum, like the Ethereum ecosystem and their ecosystem. And I think it's because more and more people have found out that like, it's just like from a network effects perspective, it's just so much easier to tap into the existing tooling around the Ethereum community than it is to go and try to bootstrap that tooling yourself. So I guess the answer to that for Connext is it's complicated. We are fundamentally an Ethereum like project in the sense that we started with that ecosystem and we work really closest with that ecosystem. But what we found is that like there are people kind of in all ecosystems, and like for at the moment, Connext is deployed on Ethereum compatible chains in all of these different sorts of ecosystems. So there's people in places like Avalanche and like the Cosmos ecosystem, things like that, that are also heavily using us. And then of course we now have a lot of interest in also porting to other chains entirely, things like Solana, things like Terra, which are completely not Ethereum compatible. So I think the thesis is like eventually, we'll probably have like Ethereum compatibility dominance everywhere, and so that will be the majority of the network. But I think eventually, similar to the internet, you're going to be touching places that are a little bit like more heterogeneous, and you'll still want to like access it, like applications and use cases there.
Yeah. Do you see any, is the basic advantage of having Ethereum at this point integrate with so many other layers and projects and apps and dApps, is that it's just become the network effect where it's not to say it's perfectly designed, and I'm sure there'll constantly be improvements, but is there sort of an intrinsic need for all human beings and crypto to be building on one protocol, or does that situation in and of itself present an instability where it's like that's likely to explode out and then there'll be 5 or 10? Like, how do you see that? Like, I'm fascinated by Ethereum and its propensity for success or failure, however you define that.
I'm fascinated by it too. And I actually would love to dive into that because I think I've spent a lot of time trying to understand like what are the things that has made Ethereum super successful. And I think there's a lot of things that you wouldn't really expect. Like I don't think Ethereum has done a great job of executing in many ways, but at the same time, I think the community is incredible and like the culture is incredible. I think in this specific case, it's actually like, I actually like my mental model for it is that it's kind of similar to JavaScript, where it's like if you ever talk to any software developers about JavaScript and about web development and the fact that JavaScript basically won web development, and everybody hates JavaScript, right? Nobody thinks it's a good paradigm for building applications at all, but it's everywhere, and it's so common now, and it's so like ubiquitous now that people are just like, okay, well, we might as well just find ways to like make this thing better. And they have made the experience of utilizing JavaScript, using things like TypeScript and stuff like that a lot better than it used to be. But it's like people have, it's like ultimately what it was just sort of like the network effect and the Lindy of all of the developer tooling and all of the people that went and built a bunch of JavaScript applications and wrote tutorials and like created like modules for people to use. And I think that's kind of what's happening in the Ethereum ecosystem, where it's like, Solidity isn't great in many ways. The Ethereum virtual machine isn't great in many ways. A lot of people in the space, and they're absolutely right about this, there's a lot of like technical researchers in the space that are like, no, if we're going to build another system, we might as well build something a lot better. Like,
yeah,
you should, because there are better options.
This kind of reminds me.
But at the same time,
as a slight tangent to this, it's just by analogy, it feels like if you consider what evolution is and the evolutionary design process, you take something that is like your MVP, and then you just keep adding to it, and you don't rarely do you hit the hard reset and then just start over again. And I learned about this recent example of this in the real world. So a giraffe has a thing called it's called a recurrent laryngeal nerve, and basically it goes from its mouth all the way down its neck, around some part of its spine, all the way up to its brain. And so it has this it's a really important nerve that like tells it what it's eating and everything else. And the signal has to go all the way down and all the way up the neck, which is obviously very long, where it would make way more sense if it just went choof right there, but it's never going to reroute itself, because it's a nerve. Right. So it's like, as the giraffe neck's extended, it has become far less practical than it was when it was like our configuration. Right. So yeah, but continue on. So
it's actually really interesting because like this is something that I spent a bunch of time thinking about too, is like when you have like the progress of, I guess like the way that progress happens and the way that innovation happens, and I guess the way that evolution happens, like the way that things move forward tends to be this iterative process. And like, you don't really tend to go back and redo things unless the thing that you went back and like basically, I think the conditions that you have to meet in order for it to be worthwhile to do something like that is that the new mechanism of doing something has to just be like 10x better. Mm-hmm. And if it's not, like the activation energy needed to go all the way back and redo things, even if it's like 2 or 3 times better, the activation energy to go back and redo it is not worth it. And I kind of wonder why that is. I mean, I feel like it probably has to do with the fact that like if you were constantly able to just like make small iterative 2x, 3x changes, I don't think that anything would ever go anywhere. Because like you'd spend so much time redoing a bunch of work that has already been done that like you wouldn't actually have real progress. And so like it's almost like there's some sort of fundamental natural law around the idea of like, do pinky toes need to exist? No, they're a completely useless appendage. But is it genuinely worthwhile for evolution to get rid of them? Absolutely not. And if it isn't worthwhile, then it's not going to happen.
Yeah, it's like the male nipple.
It's like, exactly.
Yeah.
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 So I think that definitely is the case in the Ethereum ecosystem. There's a lot of there's a lot of dumb stuff associated with Solidity. There's a lot of gotchas. There's a lot of really like strange things about it, but the amount of time and effort required to go and change them, and the amount of versus the amount of benefit that you get out of them is very it just isn't, the calculus isn't there yet for I think most people at this stage.
How about the important parts of Ethereum, like the gas prices everyone talks about, the amount of money it would take to send money back and forth. Somebody sent like a $90 Ethereum transfer and it costs $100 in gas fees. That seems like a major structural design concern. Is that something you've investigated or have a perspective on?
Yeah. So prior to being a bridge and interoperability organization, Connext was a research and development lab. We were actually working. We've been working since 2017 on scalability, and this was something that we were really focused on because we, the whole thesis behind why we started Connext was, let's find a way to. We had really, really strongly believed in the technology. We really strongly believed that that Ethereum and this broader ecosystem can actually produce a lot of material good for the world. And so the goal was always, okay, how can we actually bring this to a wider audience, not just in terms of user experience, but actually scale the technology to get there. Now, one of the things that I think, we've sort of we've talked about this now for many, many years, but it's like as the community grows and grows and grows, you end up having to repeat it because there's new people coming in that are like, oh, why is Ethereum so expensive? And I think something that has been apparent to a lot of people in the space since 2017 is the layer one itself is not designed for to be operated in that way. It shouldn't be operated in that way. Layer one block space is fundamentally extremely scarce and extremely expensive, extremely valuable. And so there's no real reason why you shouldn't just be running every kind of application on layer twos to begin with, and then just reserving layer one block space for layer two proofs only for layer two proofs, and only having proofs actually happen there. This is something that we used to talk about a lot when we were let's find ways to make it so that users never, this was in the context of things like Plasma and state channels, which are early layer two constructions. And the topic was always okay, well, we understand that users have to do X, Y, Z, but let's try to find ways to make it so that users never have to go back to layer one if they don't want to. They can just go to layer two. It's a one-time migration, then they just stay there forever. I think that was a bit naive because we didn't really realize how piecemeal a lot of this stuff was going to be. We didn't realize there's going to be this huge ecosystem that now has to migrate, and you have all of the, again, it's the Lindy of all of the exchanges plug into Ethereum layer one and not layer two yet. A lot of the wallets only support layer ones and not all of layer twos. All of these little gotchas that make it so that it's still more valuable for people, in some cases, for people to do things on layer one than it is on layer two. But the reality is, I think the long-term goal was always, yes, Ethereum is too expensive. It is. It's designed to be. That's what you're paying for is the security. So, but you can do the sub 5 cent transactions on layer two. That's only going to get cheaper with time as well.
The layer two transactions will get cheaper with time. And do you presume
layer
that
one will get more expensive?
Really? And then do you see what's the practical use of Ether to people in the future? I assume, tell me how you see this differently. Is that in the future, as we're building forth, we converge in a world where people aren't buying Ether to do things. They're buying and using and trading and exchanging on layer two apps. Layer one, people might still own it to own an investment stake in Ethereum. Is that kind of how you see it? Is that there's this, it's almost like the land grab underneath isn't really used for anything other than just investment speculation?
So one of the big things that ETH will do once ETH2 rolls around is the asset itself is used for economic security. So the amount of staked ETH is directly correlated with it. It basically directly represents the security of the system. And so, the idea is like the strength of the asset comes from the fact that you want this to be as secure of a system as possible. You want to stake as much of it as possible in order to operate this ecosystem. This isn't, it's like a slightly different economic model than like proof of work in that like you have you're not selling your assets to go buy a bunch of computing hardware and then using that computing hardware. So you're using the assets directly, and so it's like a little bit, you're sort of like closing the loop on the activity that's already happening from the perspective of miners. But I think one other thing there that's interesting is that a lot of the layer 2s also will use ETH as their gas asset to begin with anyway. So like Arbitrary and Optimism are going to definitely continue doing that forever. ZK Sync will definitely do that. And I think many of the others will also try to do that. Of course, there is a price action benefit of having your own token be used on the layer 2, but the user experience hurdle is also a lot bigger then, because the user has to like go and say, okay, well, I'm on to this layer 2 on this like roll up or whatever. Now I need to figure out how to get the gas asset. This is something that we deal with all the time. It's like users bridge from one chain to another, and they're like, oh, this is an awesome experience, and then they're there, and then they're like, oh, how do we pay for anything? All right, now we have to go figure out some way to get the like actual chain's native asset over, and most of those are not available on bridges, and it's just like a huge mess.
Is the pathway forward to have better bridges between different side chains off of Ethereum?
To solve that problem, I think there's a couple of things. So one of the things that a lot of people are doing, and our community's asked us a bunch about this, we're working on it. We haven't like prioritized it as much yet. But like we have some instances where we've done this where we just dust wallets. So any new wallet that bridges over to an ecosystem just gets like a very, very, very tiny airdrop that allows them to do like a couple of transactions. And that basically gives enough money to like then use the funds that you bridged over, swap them for more gas, and that way you can go use the ecosystem. I personally still just dislike that whole user flow. I mean, I think the whole concept of needing to dust wallets is silly too, and it's like this may be just my like neuroticism and OCD, but I'm just like, I don't like having a lot of dust of a bunch of different assets in every wallet either. I think it's just kind of silly. So I think the better thing in the future will be just like one of the things that Connext allows you to do will be like actually calling contracts across chain. So I think one of the core things that will happen is like whatever activity users want to do on XYZ chain, they'll just actually do it, but pay gas on the sending chain. They won't have to like pay gas on the receiving chain ever to begin with. And they could just keep their assets on that sending chain as well if they'd like. The other kind of use case that I think is going to be interesting is like being able to swap into any asset on the receiving chain using local liquidity from a DEX. So like this is something that like I was actually really, really pushing for this a year ago, and there were a lot of people that really, really saying like, no, this is not going to work. Of course you want like every token is going to want to be listed on a bridge, and they're going to want to bootstrap bridge liquidity and stuff. But the reality is every token issuer has already gone through this whole process where they've like gone and built liquidity for their token on a bunch of DEXs, and they've usually paid a bunch of incentives to do that. And so the cost of actually doing that and maintaining it is quite high for them. I think the idea that they would then also go and do that for a bridge in order to take their token across chains is kind of, it's a higher cost than what most people are going to be capable of paying or will want to pay in many cases. There's obviously going to be notable exceptions where like a lot of the blue chip assets, of course, get liquidity everywhere. For instance, in our case, like we see the most liquid things being stablecoins, ETH, WBTC, and then to an extent, some of the like chains native tokens that are being used for gas sometimes. But for anything else that's long tail, like if you have USDC on one chain and what you're trying to get to is like XYZ shitcoin on another chain that doesn't have a lot of liquidity, it seems silly like that you would need to go and find some bridge with liquidity for it versus just transfer the USDC over and as part of the same transaction source liquidity from like a local AMM or a local DEX.
Can I pause you there? You've covered a lot of ground. So yeah. let me recap the dusting concept to make sure I get it. So dusting is this concept where wallets are airdropped with a number of different cryptos into the wallets to incentivize people to make a few early transactions. Is that kind of the reason behind dusting? Just to get people familiar with it?
Yeah, usually this will be done by like the chain's implementation team. So like, for example, the Polygon bridge did this for a while, where any account that transferred over the Polygon bridge the first time they transferred would just receive a small amount of Matic. It wasn't a ton. It was just like enough for 10 transactions or something. But it was just enough that way you could actually go and do things on the chain. You weren't just stuck there and stranded forever until somebody gave you gas.
Right.
Yeah.
And
chain operators are usually happy to kind of do this because it's just a way to get people to use things, and it doesn't really cost a lot.
Yeah, it feels similar to the marketing concept of giving people, you sign up for Coinbase and you get $10 or $20 in Bitcoin, and then you can move around, you get comfortable with it, and then you're more likely to purchase more and use the wallet more. So, and the problem with that, you feel is it that from a purist standpoint, do you feel that these tokens and these chains shouldn't do this, or that it's messy somehow? Because what's the reason to not want to do this?
So I keep kicking my table.
Oh, all good.
I think so there's a couple of problems with it. The first is that it's not like you have to sort of be careful about like it being abused, because it's not easy to like go create a bunch of new Coinbase accounts and like potentially get thousands of dollars of like free Coinbase credits because you just like amass like 100 accounts all like in a day and bootstrapped all the liquidity. Whereas on a blockchain, it's like it costs you nothing to like go and generate a bunch of fees. So that's one of the issues, is sort of the Sybil attack vector of like people just go and create a bunch of accounts and get a bunch of the gas and like just like get basically take all of the dust funds away from the pool. There's really no way to stop that. I think like the chains that kind of do it, they just sort of keep an eye on it. And if it happens, they're just like, okay, well that sucks. But there's no real way to do anything about it. I think the other thing is also just like, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. I just want to ask you, when I think about the reason that doesn't happen on Coinbase or happen on Uber or any other apps, it's generally that they require an email confirmation or SMS text confirmation, and it's really hard to get like infinite amount of emails. You can do it, but it's like hindrance. Do you feel that could they implement a similar strategy? Like, could you have, or is that just anti the whole concept of decentralization in the first place? Like, is there anything that you could use to slow people down?
You could. I mean, I think that people have done stuff like that. They've basically, I know that there's some instances where folks have built mechanisms, slightly more complex mechanisms to dust accounts, where it's like they like check to see a little bit about the transaction history and make sure that this is like an account that has a certain amount of transactions in it and things like that. So there's basically some like spam filtering that you can do. I think checking for actual identity is like more difficult, because it does kind of go against like the reason that people are using the space anyway. So it's like, from the perspective of a user, you're using something like a bridge or some sort of cross-chain mechanism to get between chains, because like you could go through a centralized exchange for that. You could go through Coinbase, but the whole kind of benefit is that you don't need to, because you are using this like on-chain mechanism rather than having to go create an account in Coinbase. So having to then go create an account in a bridge to do it sort of defeats the purpose. And I mean, I think that's not really the only purpose, but it does defeat like a part of the purpose for a lot of the people, in the same way that like if you had email requirements for DEXs, a lot of people would be like, well, I'll just go use Coinbase then. Yeah.
There's really not, you lose the whole advantage in the first place. That makes sense. All right. So yeah, I can see that just being a situation that is like slowed, but never really fully contained, which is the game. So then fast forward to the last point you're making around the side chains and the gas on Ethereum. Expand more around that. So this is the case that you were making that you thought other people thought would be impossible. Why did they think it was impossible to do? And can you explain what it is again? The debate?
Yeah. So the idea is basically like, this kind of ties back to the earlier concept that I said, which is like, the ideal end state is that users don't have to consciously think about what chain they're on. right? That like needing to do that is something that you don't really do on the internet today. Like there was a brief period in the internet's history where, not really brief, but there was a period in the internet's history where you actually had to like manually connect to another network. Right? You were just like, I am here in this university and I'm connecting to this other network somewhere else in the world. And you had to like type in telnet blah 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 in order to actually get there. You don't do that anymore because that's just terrible user experience. And I think like as the number of chains proliferates, as the ecosystem grows, and we'll sort of have to see where it ends up. But I think like it's going to be increasingly likely that we end up in some sort of place where you'll have a separation between the chains, which are kind of like the infrastructure layer that developers care about, and then the application, which is what the user cares about. And I think the idea is that all of this can be abstracted behind the application layer, where from the application's perspective, or like from the user's perspective interacting with the application, they don't need to know that this thing is running on many different chains all at once. They don't need to know that they are on XYZ chain. They need to get to this other chain to be able to use this app. Instead, what should just happen is like they should just pay gas on the chain that they're on, and just make a transaction, and it should just work wherever they are. So that's kind of, it's like I understand as an interrupt solution, dusting and stuff makes a lot of sense, but I think the ideological solution, or my ideal solution is basically get to the point where it just doesn't even matter, because as a user, you are just always using applications no matter where they are using the same flow. You build this like very interwoven cross-chain ecosystem where it's very possible to just pay gas where you are to do a transaction on another chain, and there's no downside to doing that.
And is that where you feel like Connext has the opportunity, where you're effectively building? I think of, electricity, right? If I had a current, if I wanted to connect, what would be a better example? It's like the whole thinking of how you go from point A to point B is not something that the user will really ever be expected to do. But underneath the hood on the infrastructure layer, there's a whole bunch of wiring. It's like if I put in Google Maps that I want to go to the airport, like it's calculating all sorts of things that incorporate traffic and road closures and what routes and time, all those things. And it's like, okay, hit go. And then I just follow the directions. That feels kind of like what you're describing. And then the algorithm underneath the hood says, this is, given all the factors, this is the best path to take. And so just do that. Approve, sounds good. And then you just make the transaction. Is that
Exactly.
Is that just an inevitable thing, or are there serious design decisions that have to be made? Because in the case of the internet, it feels like, yeah, we understand we all want to be on the same network because we all benefit from being able to clearly communicate with each other. And so let's just build that. And then the internet protocols, TCP, IP, and everything else came around. Is that the direction things are, or is it more complicated in the blockchain world?
Yeah. So the question of is it inevitable is always an interesting one, because I think like for a lot of these kinds of, it's like you could almost say like blockchains are an inevitable conclusion of of what happened to the internet, because like there's a sequence of events that started with the internet that ended up here, and it seems like the economic incentives have just pushed us in this direction. Now I don't know to what extent that's the case, but I do think that in this case, like given the market conditions that exist today, and barring any absolutely massive breakthrough innovation that happens that basically something that is a 10x innovation that allows us to go all the way back and say, oh, actually, our whole understanding of blockchains was just completely incorrect. Like everything that we have known about blockchains since the days of Bitcoin is trash, and we need to throw it all out. And because we now have a 10x improvement against that. A lot of people have claimed to have done that with certain layer ones. A lot of people say that they have ways. Yeah, I mean, like that was like, that was like the whole premise of IOTA, for instance, was like, oh, blockchains, the idea of having this like linked list, which is like a block and then linked to another block and another block, like that whole concept is not scalable. Instead, let's have a directed acyclic graph, which is basically a more kind of complex mechanism for linking of transactions. And by having that more complex mechanism, you can create this more scalable system. And I think what ended up happening was like, yes, in some cases that may be a little bit more scalable, but then you trade off a lot of complexity, you trade off a lot of other sorts of issues. And the reality is any of those projects that have hit scale have actually run into the exact same problems that exist on Ethereum, or in many cases worse because of the complexity and everything just actually completely breaks. And so I think it's like one of those things where it's like we have not yet come across something that is a 10x improvement for decentralized coordination than the existing blockchains. And we are continuing to iterate on this model of existing blockchains, and the direction that model is going now is heading towards exactly what you talked about, which is this mechanism of there are many chains and there's routing between them, and it's similar to the internet. And that's actually the exact analogy that we draw for Connext a lot of the time, because that is effectively what we're doing. Even the nodes in our network are literally called routers, because they relay packets between chains in the same way that internet routers do. Now, I guess the core kind of point there is like, it is inevitable so long as nothing comes and completely shakes our current understanding of things. And if that kind of disruptive innovation happens, of course, like most of everything everyone is doing in the space is now bunk, and we need to go learn something completely new, which is pretty kind of cool, but also would be surprising.
It seems like if you take a step back and look at it from first principles, it comes down to where is the information stored and how is it transmitted, right? And like the internet was, hey, we're going to centralize this inside of computers that are going to be in your house, and they're going to talk to other computers in other houses, and the information is stored on a chip in your computer in your house. And then it's like, hey, then we have servers. And it's like, well, that server is going to provide computational power that's dedicated and local at some location nearby. And then it's in the cloud, which is just in a giant factory that Amazon or Google run. Now we say, rather than centralize that, let's have that be all over the place. And so all the information everywhere is stored everywhere. And that is only possible when computational power is really high, when it's really efficient to be able to run duplicate, effectively like redundant databases all over the place. And that to me seems like that is not likely to, I don't see how what else could there possibly be? I mean, quantum computers.
There's the Solana thesis. Yeah.
Oh,
exactly. It's stuff like that. Yeah.
What's the Solana thesis?
So basically like, sorry. That might be a little bit late on my end, but, so it's you actually hit the nail on the head. It's kind of interesting because it's like blockchains and this kind of mechanism for like effectively cloud computing, right? That's effectively what blockchains are doing, is they're taking cloud computing, but instead of having it be in a warehouse, it's like now decentralized in the way that traditional computing and traditional internet was decentralized. And it's sort of, you hit the nail on the head with saying that, that a lot of the reason for this is that our ability to compute things, computing power itself has accelerated quite a bit because of Moore's law and things like that. And so Solana's thesis is just that is going to continue to happen. And so that we should just, instead of trying to have this mechanism of scaling blockchains where we just fragment everything outwards, let's just bet on the fact that the hardware itself will just become 100x cheaper and better over the course of the next 10, 15 years. Which is, it's not a bad bet. I mean, I think like, I can understand why a lot of VCs like Solana, because VCs love Moore's law.
Yeah.
This is like a thing that they all talk about, where they're like, no, but Moore's law, everything's going to get cheaper. And so therefore we need to make bets on everything getting cheaper, like all compute getting cheaper, which it's fair. It has worked so far. It's slowing down and I don't think it's going to work forever. But at the same time, like it's worked so far. And the thesis is that like, if computers even at home computers get much, much, much better, the downsides of Solana, which are that it's really expensive and difficult to run, so because of that needs to be run in data centers. The downsides of that just disappear, right? Because you no longer need data centers for those things. Now, of course, it's like Solana is making this bet on the future, on like what is the future of computing, and it's unclear like how that's going to play out, but it is an interesting bet for sure.
Do you subscribe? Do you think that that's more likely to be true than not? That the efficiency in hardware and computational power is high enough, fast enough that Solana is successful?
So I do think so. I think that while more so, I have three thoughts around this, which are sort of like fragmented, and they ultimately lead to an opinion, but they are kind of fragmented thoughts. The first thought is Moore's law was a thing until relatively recently, and like the rate at which we have been making progress in terms of basically chip density has decreased, and it's kind of tapered off. That's not to say that we might not make some breakthroughs in the future, but we are going to start hitting like actual physical limits, and those physical limits are going to start going into the quantum realm at some point or another. So we will hit a certain point where this becomes a problem. The second point around this is that said, I always think it is a bad idea to bet against human innovation. The pace of human innovation, I don't know about. Like it might take 10 years, it might take 20 years, it might take 50 years. Do I think inevitably at some point we will get to the point where like computing power density actually gets to the point where you could run Solana as it stands now at home? Yeah, probably. I think that's very, very highly likely, actually. I think there's like, we're building better and better computers every year. But the last point that I have about this, and this is what leads me to say that this is the reason why, like, again, like I respect Solana's ecosystem. I actually think that a lot more people should respect Solana's ecosystem, especially in the ETH ecosystem. Because I think that sometimes people turn blinders on and don't look at other things, which isn't good. But I think the reason that I ideologically don't like Solana or don't believe it to be the right solution is because I think the thing that they're missing is as part of their calculus and as part of their bet is the social and sort of like sociological and economic aspect of making this bet on the future, which is when you wait to decentralize a lot, when you don't have a credible, really, really credible path, and when you wait for a long time to decentralize, power ends up kind of sequestering into the hands of a select few groups of people. And then it's over time, the incentives dictate that those people are not going to give that power out. And I think that means that, even if Solana's thesis ends up being right, I think it's highly, highly unlikely that they actually build a truly decentralized ecosystem. I think it will, even if you end up being able to run this stuff at home, you'll likely end up in a world where Solana's control will still remain in the hands of like a relatively smaller set of operators or data providers.
How would that work in the transition of death? So like that's obviously a big part of governments is how voting and change of control happens. If that is the case where Solana, and take Solana for example, it could be many other protocols and layer ones, how does that happen? Where is there a set process, or is that still we're figuring that out? Like how somebody gets old, they say I don't want to do this anymore, or they die.
I mean, it's difficult to tell because these are new systems, but at the same time, I think it's always just going to come down to like economic incentives, right? So it's like you don't want to create blockchain old money. That's not a good thing. And when we get to that point, it's going to be kind of a problem, right? Like you have railroad company old money. People who are like people who are families that have descended from, some of the original families that built the original railroad corporations, and they have an absurd, ludicrous amount of wealth. And they have been able to use that position of having a ludicrous amount of wealth to generate even more ludicrous amounts of wealth because of the way that the world works at the moment. I think that is the concern that I have. It's like, even if the people who are in charge or the people who actually control that power die out, I think ultimately they will beget that to families, to corporations, to a certain select groups of people. And like it might still be a larger group of people, but the relative ratio of that number of people versus the rest of the population will be quite small. Similar to kind of, again, the railroad and other kinds of like historic wealth in the U.S. and the rest of the world today.
Yeah. There was this video and book has been stuck in my head for so long, and it seems to mimic a lot of the patterns that you're talking about. The Ray Dalio's World Changing Order. Have you seen this or read any of the book? It's fascinating. It's basically, for a long time I thought that there was sort of complete randomness at the highest level of economics in the world. And he paints this picture that is much different and very compelling, which is that there's this similar to, Arjun is born, he grows up as a child, he grows into adolescence, you have your adulthood, you get old, you kind of get slow, frail, brittle, and then you die. And that pattern happens on a societal level. So as a society is very young and ambitious and hardworking, there's a lot. Everyone is roughly equal in wealth, roughly equal in many different measures. They're all working hard. They're contributing. Things get better. As high work and hard situations compound, then you have innovations and technologies and high education, great military, firm organization of governments. And as that happens, people benefit from that. And they say, life is good. Let's take it back a little bit. Let's slow down. We're less productive. We get fat. We drink our champagnes. And the compounding wealth starts to accumulate. So it's like, as I have more wealth, the cycle gets more condensed. And this is true in the Dutch Empire, the British Empire, the American Empire, and empires before us, where we get overextended. We have, 75 military bases all over the country, or many different countries. And then that history that says, hey, we've been successful in the past, we're more likely to believe that we're successful in the future, that starts to erode. And then all of a sudden you have this high political agitation situation and uncertainty, where wealth distribution is really high, economic output, it starts to slow. And then there's an increasing world empire that's chasing it. And right now, the United States and China are pretty close in GDP. Yeah. China with a massive population and growing much faster. And he seems, from an American perspective, I'm like, oh, that kind of sucks. But then you realize that's just the way it is. That's just like learning I'm going to die one day. And so it's not, the attitude has shifted for me, which has like been, fuck, I don't want that to happen to my country, to, hey, maybe there's another perspective. Maybe it's like this decentralization of crypto and organizations and the economy and the interworking of the economy across the world. Maybe that's the thing that's going to supersede the American empire. And I don't know. I've just been thinking about that because it seems to parallel so many other things. Like as power condenses, it gets more fragile to an overthrow of the whole system.
Yeah. So I actually, now that you've described it, I have actually heard about this book. Is it a book?
It's a book and a YouTube video, about 45 minutes long.
Okay, cool. I think I have heard about the book, and I've heard about this described too. And I completely agree. It's a really fascinating idea. And like, it's absolutely true that like, this is sort of just like the life cycle of empires, and it doesn't really matter what those empires are, whether they're like, they've been like historic, actual physical empires to being economic empires, like in the modern day, or even companies, right?
Yeah.
You're seeing this exact life cycle play out for so many corporations today. Arguably Facebook is in the midst of this attempting to avoid this fate right now.
Yeah. And I think,
I think it's kind of interesting. Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think Facebook's shift to Meta is almost a attempt to create a second life, where they're like, hey, maybe if we completely transition, you're effectively pivoting their whole business model, which is just nuts. But it seems like that's their attempt, because this is not even just about empires. It's really about power. Any sort of centralization of conscious power goes through this, like, climb it up, you're at the peak, you get cush, you enjoy it, and then there's another rising power.
Yeah, I think that, the fact that Facebook is pivoting everything into Meta, and it's not even like that market really exists yet. Like that suggests a level of desperation that is greater than what I really expected that exists there. And it's clear that they think that they understand the situation that they're in. And it's astounding that they were willing to like pivot that hard into something that, it's
I know, man. I remember
it's crazy.
As a startup founder, it's like my last company, we raised about 23 million. And we had a good business, 60 employees, and we had to pivot. And I remember like losing sleep multiple nights, feeling like pivoting at this stage, how could we do that? And now I'm like, I'm such a little bitch. That was, they're a $1 trillion company and they can pivot.
Yeah, well, I mean, it remains to be seen whether like it's like, it's like this is a Hail Mary. So it can either like save the entire organization, which again, it's like now that we have this decentralized option, if we didn't have this decentralized option, I think it could save the entire organization. But because we have this decentralized option, I think there is a legitimate contender against this, which is that people will just not want to pay the 45% meta marketplace fee or whatever it is. Super ridiculous. But I mean, it's like this is either going to be like a savior moment or death throes.
Yeah.
Right. This is either like this is either where it falls apart or like where it somehow comes out of the ashes.
Yeah. How do you see the growth of VR in particular? It seems like that's the real bet here is the Ready Player One. You put it on, all the haptic sensors are there. You and I, instead of looking at a screen, we're like indistinguishable from being in the same room, even though we're in different countries. Is that something that you've thought about or can see that vision clearly, or are you more skeptical?
I used to be like pretty skeptical that like I was just like, so I think this was something that I was always like, yeah, okay, like we'll be able to have use cases for VR, and this is going to be like an important thing. But I was always really skeptical that it would be something that people would spend a lot of time doing, because I was like, people would do it for like purpose-built reasons. You might have like games and experiences, like in the reason that I was skeptical was just like there's just so many other ways that people have of interacting with the world right now, and so many other interesting things that people are doing. That said, I recently got an Oculus Quest, and I have to say, I mean, it's really good. It is now at the point where, and I understand why Facebook wants to double down on this, because I think if they do it correctly, which I really don't think they will, but if they do it correctly, the Oculus Quest it's sort of at the point where it's like iPhone moment, where like it will become a thing that people will just start like purchase. There'll be this one thing that people will start getting it for, and then after that, it will people will start building more and more things on top of it as a platform, and then it'll just like skyrocket. Because like even, I mean, the Quest is like a $300 device, $400 device, something like that. And like it's like fully integrated. So there's like headphones, there's cameras built into it, so you can actually like you draw out a boundary that you're in, and then if you exceed that boundary, it automatically switches to showing you the real world, so that you don't actually like bump into things. And you can draw custom boundaries, so like you basically could use your room space however you want. And then that gets ported with you into like whatever you're doing. And you can actually do even more than that. So like they're continuously adding some really interesting stuff. You can bring your chair into VR. You basically just scan your chair with your thing and you just put it in. You can bring your keyboard and your laptop in. You can actually set up a work desk. You could with like many virtual screens, and like it's actually like surprisingly really good. Now, the one thing that I think is really not great about it is that it's still super Facebook-y. Like it's still like really clearly a closed environment. And, I think that what they're trying to do is do the same thing that Apple did in the early days of the iPhone, where it was like very highly curated, very like highly sort of, let's make this the best kind of like this niche experience and stuff like that. But I actually think that that's a problem, because the world has moved past that. Like I think we've gotten to the point now where people, like, if you want this to be a platform that people build on top of, what they should just do is like charge for the device. That's fine, understandable. But, make the marketplace open, have like basic content creation, stuff like that, but make the marketplace open. Don't like have it be only Facebook applications. Make it so that other browsers exist. Don't use only Facebook's shitty browser. Like obviously they're collecting your private data. It's ridiculous. Let people come and like build their own experiences in VR and experiment with it, because that's what needs to happen first before you try to monetize. Don't start charging people 50% right now before people even know what they're doing. Like it doesn't make a lot of sense. It's like at this stage, everything is a POC in VR. You should treat it as such.
Yeah. Well, what's the pushback? Because everything you said seems like the almost obvious playbook, which is allow external app developers. I mean, do you think they're just feeling the pressures of generating revenue, and that's why they want to establish that rate up front, so people aren't, up in arms when they do come out with a transaction fee.
Yeah. Have you heard of somebody named Simon Wardley?
No, I don't think so.
So Simon Wardley is this like business person and thinker who has spent a lot of time analyzing the ways that like basically like part like analyzing the way that like innovation happens and businesses kind of like grow, and it's sort of similar to the empire concept we were talking about, like how innovation goes from like starting and then businesses get created around it, those businesses grow to be monopolies, and then how they like sort of die out in the future at some point. And he one of the things that he's pioneered is this idea of Wardley mapping, which is where you try to map out the dependencies for your organization. This is like a really great strategic thinking tool where you map out the dependencies for your organization to figure out what assumptions are you making about the market and about like the things that you need in the market, and versus where those things are in terms of their innovation and development lifecycle. And one of the things that he posits is like every kind of innovation goes through like the space, and along this timeline you kind of like start on one side, and on one side there is you have the kind of like inception moment of this is like a totally new POC thing, and then you get to the point where it's like the like kind of following the like crossing the chasm, that you get to kind of like the early majority stage where it starts to become productized, and then you get to this like later majority stage where it's now like scaled and becomes like large scale products, and it's starting to become commoditized. And then over time, by the time you kind of get to like the tail end of things effectively become utilities, right? That you start achieving race to the bottom situations on pricing and things like that. So like electricity obviously is in the utility category, but things like the internet access and stuff like that is getting to that point where like it's like perfect pricing amongst different competitors, and it's not like there's anything one can do better over the other. And what he talks about is that like everything follows this life cycle, and the kind of ethos of open source and the kind of benefit of open source and the reason that open source exists is it sort of pushes things along that life cycle a lot further until they get to that utility section. And as a company, especially as a large company that like builds a product when it's really innovative, you start to move along this path, and eventually you get to the point where you're like, okay, the thing that I'm doing, the thing that is my primary business driver, is now effectively is going to become a utility soon. And when that happens, I no longer have a business. So either there's like two options: either you continue trying to innovate, you basically completely reinvent yourself, or you try to do what all traditional companies do, which is IP license the shit out of everything, go after, like aggressively start suing people, like closed source development, like try to, enforce, like build regulatory systems around what you're doing. Like, take like the Visa model, right? It's like try to build a bunch of regulatory systems around what you're doing to like maintain that monopoly for as long as you can. Now, of course, it will head in that direction. And I think Visa is like a quintessential example of like, you can hold on to that power for a really, really, really long time. And then one day someone is just going to come in and invent blockchains. And like, this thing is going to disrupt you one way or another. There's nothing you can do about it. Like people will disrupt the concept of regulations to get around you. Innovation.
Yeah. It's almost like technology. If you just abstract what technology is, it's all these things together. It's like whether I'm trying to book a hotel for the night, I'm trying to send an email, I'm trying to get a car, I'm trying to buy headphone technology. Like even these Bose headphones we're wearing, I'm sure one day it's like the same value of sound cancellation and music production will be invisible. It won't even be there, and then it'll be effectively free. Right. And maybe it'll be digital, so we won't even. There's no physical representation of it in the first place. So that it's like whatever comes into being in the first place has to eventually have a path towards obsolescence, right? Exactly.
And I think that's the thing, is like, that's the incentives of large scale corporation. I think when you're a smaller company and you have you as an innovator, as a founder, as a CEO, as basically a team that is innovating, when you still have kind of control over a company, you're able to say, okay, you know what? Like, this is going to die at some point. So like, screw it. We will throw that out. We'll build new innovative things. But when you're a large company, especially a large publicly traded company, that's not really what your investors want to hear, right? Like you're trying to show the returns. And so I think there's like a conservative bias that sort of exists in a large company because you have such a large group of stakeholders now who care about what you're doing. And because you have that conservative bias, everybody's just like, no, let's find ways to monetize this as fast as possible, as much as possible. Because we can't afford to have, a couple of quarters of negative revenue or a couple of quarters of like less revenue, because that's just not the way that the incentives work around stocks, right? Like if that happens, Facebook's stock crashes, people lose faith in the product. A lot of people pull their money out of Facebook, and then now there's like a huge hit, and then you'll have like the shareholders meeting, and then they'll just fire Zuckerberg. So it's like it's like I'm sure Mark is in a position where it's like even and this is the shitty thing. It's like I don't know if Mark Zuckerberg is a good person or not. It doesn't really matter ultimately, because the reality is the incentives compel him, right? If he says no. This has happened in so many companies, and I mean, I'm sure this is, this is eventually the case with every company, even companies like Google, where they retain this awesome, like, let's do the best we can kind of culture and like retain control for a very long period of time. It's like at some point people retire, at some point people are forced out, and like then you are replaced by somebody else who is more likely to say yes. And like if Mark says no, what's going to happen? They're just going to fire him, right? Like. There's no benefit to him saying no. It's just he'll get fired, and then somebody else will get put in his position who will have lower ethical capacity, or will like be more willing to make compromises.
Yeah. And do you view that as do you think of it as the structure of the company itself? So when it comes to incentives of the leadership, it's really about who's able to put pressure, meaning who has a voting share in the direction of this company, and the way that companies are generally structured in our world is that there's individual share owners. So a company is split into maybe 10 million different parts, and then there can be, anywhere up to 10 million different owners. And then you could always create more shares and create more dilution. So there's some finite number of shareholders, but those aren't the decision makers. It's the board of directors, which has an obligation to the people who own the shares. And so like Twitter was acquired. The reason why the board agreed to Elon's acquisition offer was that they viewed the acquisition offer to be in the best financial interests of the shareholders. And
some of the shareholders
has to be the majority, some of the shareholders. Right. Most of the shareholders.
So it's like usually with most of these companies, only a very relatively small percentage of the shares are actually owned by like public, right? Like the majority of the shares will be held by like a smaller subset of combination of like people, like maybe founders, and then like PE funds, other kinds of like institutional like investors and things like that are dictating where this goes. So like for those people, this is in their best interest. Ultimately, if you own, 100 shares of Twitter, your voice doesn't matter at all.
Yeah.
Even if you want it to.
Yeah.
You're not even going to be in that meeting.
Yeah. And that's, I mean, to think about it in another way would be if that person who owns $100 shares has anything other than a proportional voting right to what their share is, then how would that has to be the way it is. I can't buy $100 of Twitter and have some dominant share. So it seems very parallel to the way voting works and can work governance on chain, which is like, well, your voting permissions is permissible, is like relative to how much ownership you have. And so the concern is both sides, the spectrum is like, okay, when there's no centralization, when the largest owner has 0.2%, and it's just like too many people have equal voting rights. The same thing in democracy. If it was direct democracy, everyone in the country is voting on every issue federally. It's kind of like it's an enormous amount of weight that individuals have to all do their research and come up with the right answer. So you have electorates, or in the case of a board, they represent you. It seems like that's like, what system is better than that? Do you see that incentive system that Facebook is in and the market is in as somehow being flawed systemically, and that blockchain can introduce a new governance evolution, or are you more skeptical of that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I think there's two different questions here, right? One is the type of system that exists around, private and public corporations right now, where, especially with investors and outside investors, where everything is traded on some revenue multiple against the future, and tech companies are traded against a very high revenue multiple. because the assumption for everybody is that they're going to be growing a lot all the time. Is that a negative thing for the world? I think yes. I think the reason that exists, there's a bunch of different reasons that exists. I think a big part of it is that is the way that people think about investment, and the way that the market around investments has changed over the course of the last 20, 30 years, to go from basically the internet has dramatically accelerated our ability to build highly scalable businesses, and then turn those highly scalable businesses into monopolies that then also go and monopolize other industries. And I think a lot of people have recognized that and realized that you can start trading a lot of these companies at some future valuation that is actually much, much higher than present valuation, because you have the belief that it will get to there at that point. And it's sort of self-fulfilling, because it's like, as the company, you are now incentivized to go there. And the reason that we're able to do this is because we also have been, for the last 20 years, actually almost now the last 80 years, in a very highly inflationary economy. And because of that, it's very, very cheap for us to go and get cash from places and go put it into really, really big bets like this, because the cost of holding cash yourself is extremely high. So, it's much, much smarter to go make incredibly crazy, stupid bets on things. And as an economy, we are incentivized to continue making crazy, stupid bets on things. We're incentivized to continue manufacturing things, basically living lives of excess, living these lives where, again, empires, right? We're in an economy where we are incentivized to go spend as much money as possible and produce as many consumer goods as possible, because we want to keep jobs, and we want to keep jobs, so that way we can, again, produce more. And then it's like this sort of like self-referential system. And everybody's deathly afraid of, deflationary economies, because everybody is terrified that in a deflationary economy, everything contracts. And some people bring up Japan as an example, and people lose their jobs and stuff. But there are benefits to that too, right? The benefit is, in a deflationary economy, you're not incentivized to do this. You're incentivized to instead hold assets. You're incentivized to hold US dollars, because this asset that you're holding, the normal currency, is inflating against, or is increasing in price against everything else. So everybody then wants to not spend a lot of money, and instead they want to save money. They want to not buy tons and tons of different goods. They want to only buy a few high quality goods that they care about. They want to not go and pollute the atmosphere. They want to instead go and not utilize resources as best as they possibly can, because those resources, because spending money on those resources now is a lot more expensive than spending money on those resources in the future. So, we sort of can tie a lot of these things to each other around our society, which is a little bit scary and a little bit unfortunate.
It almost is.
How does this tie to?
You go ahead, finish your point there. Or it seems like you had a.
No. Go ahead. I was going to switch gears a little bit to DAOs, but yeah.
I want to talk about DAOs in a minute if you have time to continue.
Yeah, absolutely.
I know it's late where you are.
It's totally fine.
It seems to me like when we talk about Facebook structure and stock structure and the markets and board of directors and ownership, and then parallel that into the blockchain world, it's not that dissimilar. Like, we're going to largely replicate probably a lot of the structure to that. The primary difference is the other side of the embroidery is like, what's the mechanism? What's the currency used to move, to keep track, right? Money is information that's stored on a scorecard. And when a government, which is a body of people that we give power to print as much money as they want and control interest rates, that creates a system that, number one, it's not predictable. So we don't know, like, tomorrow there could be an additional $10 trillion printed, and that changes everything. So that you pay a price for that instability or lack of predictableness in the future. And then it also, I mean, it could be inflationary or deflationary depending on what the Fed does. But that seems like to me, it's a thing that you couldn't not do. Every empire previous to American empire, or just 2022, we really when Bitcoin came around, you had to have a central way of printing money to keep track of effectively, in reality, in the world that we live in. If you're using money, the money traditionally is tied to an asset that is limited. So gold, was the primary one, because gold is difficult to mine, and the rate at which gold is mined is erratic, but it's largely not explosive. Like I can't, just go tomorrow and decide to mine gold.
Definitely a lot more stable.
Yeah, they're definitely a lot more stable. And so now it seems to me like the innovation potential is on the other side, where it's like we have the ability to just systematically program mathematically the rate at which currency is circulated. There's flaw. I mean, I don't know how big a concern you have for things like people dying that have $10 million in Bitcoin wallets, and how does that ever get accounted for? And eventually, like fast forward 200 years, and how does money flush down generations?
So I think, so I guess so first off, I'd like to say for things like DAOs and stuff, like this is actually one of my biggest fears about this space, that like I really don't want to end up recreating the existing system. And we are definitely like, I mean, we are issuing a token, and we are going to have a token based DAO as well, where the token does a lot of other things too, but we're going to have a token based DAO initially. That said, I am actually personally really against coin voting. I think it's objectively extremely bad for the world, because you're basically creating the exact same like plutocratic mechanisms that exist today with corporations, and they have the exact same incentives. So like the ultimate outcome of this is going to look exactly the same as something like Facebook, where you might have this decentralized ecosystem, but at the same time you have two things that are leading us to this very unfortunate outcome. The first is people are buying and selling your, while this is not necessarily what we want all the time, and this is not necessarily how we want the economics of the system to work, a lot of the time the reason that people are buying and selling your asset is speculation, right? They're buying and selling your asset because they think it's going to be worth a lot in the future. And they might even be pricing your asset as at a multiple against what it should be worth right now, because they think it's going to be worth that amount in like 2 or 3 years, and they're willing to hold it for that time, where they expect it'll actually just compound from there. So that's like no different than the way that people are thinking about technology stocks, and that's a problem, because of course there is a lot of importance in having financial upside for stakeholders in these ecosystems, right? That's how adoption happens. That's how you have the like Ponzonomics of things like Bitcoin and Ethereum, and that's why they have become so important and valuable. And it's also helped a lot of people, right? A lot of people have gained wealth that wouldn't have gained it otherwise. On the other hand, I think like there has to be some sort of limit. You can't have the incentive, if you have an asset where everybody keeps saying, oh, let's just keep pumping the asset of the price of this higher and higher and higher, and then let's just put the expectations on the project to like deliver to this level. What you're basically going to do is create like a king of the hill of all the protocols, where eventually the idea is you just end up with one monopolistic protocol that does everything, and that will kill everything else out. And like that's just bad. That's not how the world should work at all. Then you're just centralized everything all over again, and it's a huge problem. And then once you get to that point, or once you get to the point where it's no longer feasible, the incentives are going to be for DAO voters are going to start voting for, oh, let's start extracting value from this platform, right? Let's like have Uniswap charge higher fees and give it to the stakeholders, like the DAO holders and things like that, token holders. Sorry. The other flip side of this is well, if you don't have that incentive, then what incentive is there to actually purchase and hold these assets and utilize these assets, right? Like you might have some utility associated with it. And I think that that's really important. And that's why I think things like, the economic security of Ethereum and things like that are actually like quite important. But, barring that, what rationale is there? And this is the concern that I have for a lot of the DAO tokens, that like for a staking asset, the utility is that you need to actually stake it, because that is required to provide economic security. For a DAO token, at the moment, that doesn't exist. There's really no reason to like hold it other than the speculative value of it increasing in the future. And, the governance aspect of it is really only ever going to be used to manifest the potential value that you want to see in the future that you're speculating on. Right? That's the goal of it. So unless there's some secondary rationale to hold this asset, it's just never going to be used for anything else. And I don't really have a solution to that.
Yeah, it almost seems to me, it's like a way for people to give money to the project, right? It's like, otherwise, what would you do, right? You'd say, otherwise you have to go through, all the red tape of like creating a company and raising money and getting all these people to certify their accredited investors and wire it into your bank account. It's like, you could do that. I mean, you could consider that, right? You could say, okay, Connext is going to raise we're going to be different. We're just going to raise a traditional venture round and, crowdfund it. Now we have the crowdfunding rules, at least in the US, where you can do that. It's the same mechanics, right? Ultimately, maybe that's all it is.
Well, and the thing is, we did do all of that too, right? We did traditional fundraisers. We've raised from traditional VCs as well. The reason that we're issuing a token is because, like, my goal is for Connext to become public infrastructure, right? Connext is not a corporation. It's not Connext Labs. It's not, Connext Labs, the core team that's working on it, and we'll probably be like rebranding to something else and bring on more implementation teams and things like that, because it shouldn't be controlled by one person. It shouldn't be developed by one person, right? This is a fundamental cornerstone of the internet. It needs to be credibly neutral. It needs to be built by a large group of people all over the world that care about taking this forward for the next 100 years. And like, that's why I don't want it to be a corporation. That's why I don't want it to be like just a share-based thing. Even if it becomes a publicly traded company, that's still objectively bad, because if the internet was a publicly traded company, it would be super bad for the world. At the same time, I think, like, at the moment, we don't have any better mechanism out there in the world right now to potentially create public goods than tokens. Because to create and incentivize public goods than tokens. I think the question really just comes down to, what mechanisms are you able to use to ensure that the economics of your system actually drive you towards it being a public good, rather than eventually becoming something that people want to exploit or are capable of exploiting because they can exercise plutocratic control over it. And I think, like, the best kind of example of that is Ethereum itself, where it's like, Ethereum, it definitely has plutocratic control. There are always going to be centralizing factors, and that's always something that you have to be conscious of and stay ahead of. It's like a great example of this is like the Lido stuff that's happening. Lido is an incredible project, and I really, really like the project. But like, obviously, one of the big concerns is that a lot of the Ethereum stake, ETH2 stake, is now getting centralized under Lido, because it's such an incredible economic flywheel. It is. It's a fantastic product. And it's like such a huge innovation against what exists today that, like, it's starting to monopolize. And so figuring out, like, okay, well, how do we, embrace these kinds of things, but also make sure that we keep things decentralized is a big open question. Well, what I like about this ecosystem, and the reason that I actually, I'm not in a position right now where I'm like, oh, well, screw it, we're just going to recreating the existing system, is that there is one fundamental thing that is different between what we've tried in the past and what exists now. And that fundamental thing that is different is that it is now possible for us to build these kinds of coordination mechanisms without needing to build large institutions. My thesis is that anytime you have a large institutions get driven by incentives, because you just start averaging the like opinions of everybody in this institution, and then the average of all those opinions just becomes its incentives, and so that's why you have you can have like plenty, every person that is working in governments can want to do the right thing, but that government can still be acting in a really bad way. And the reason for that is just differing incentives. It just pulls people in different directions, and then the average of all of that comes out to be something that's shitty for individual people. I think the key innovation of this space is that for the first time ever, we have the ability to create coordination mechanisms that happen peer-to-peer between individuals. And that means that while it's true that we may end up recreating the same system, it's possible for us to recreate the same system. I think the other thing that we could also do is potentially innovate past it. Because in the past, there was no way to innovate on governance. finance. There was no way to innovate on economics. It was just too hard. It was very unscalable. Like when you get to the point where you're running, like, where do you see governance? It's like the governance of a country. You can't have the U.S. government. There's no way for the U.S. government to like tomorrow drop everything and say, okay, you know what? We're gonna try futarchy as a new government.
Yeah, we could barely vote.
Clearly, democracy
we barely believe that we all cast one vote.
That's not going to happen. Yeah. Exactly. It's like you're averaging too many opinions. You're averaging too much. There's just too much going on. It's like just scale's too large to do that. So I think that is what I'm hoping happens, is that in the process of, a lot of people talk about how like crypto is speedrunning finance and economics and governance and game theory. And I think we are absolutely speedrunning it. We're making all the same mistakes that people have made in the past. Sometimes I wish that we actually looked a little bit more into what's happened in the past to like not make those mistakes. But one thing that I am seeing that makes me a little bit hopeful is like, while we're making those mistakes, we are moving past them. And we're moving past them a lot quicker than historically we've moved past them, which has historically been like hundreds of years. And that makes me optimistic, because at a certain point we're going to catch up to where we are.
Yeah.
And then we're going to start breaking new ground. And that's where things are going to get really, really interesting, because we're going to be like finding entirely new ways to think about these systems, entirely new ways to deal with governance. And in that, my hope is, by running these experiments, in that we find something that actually works for human coordination, which would be fantastic. I mean, we've been trying to figure out how to accurately govern things since, our earliest recorded instances are in ancient Greece.
I mean, my reaction to that intuitively is that when you say we're looking for more efficient ways of governing ourselves, what you're saying is that we want to make the best decisions about the future as possible. And that means not only the best decisions for humans collectively as a species, but also other life on the planet and the planet as a whole, and other life elsewhere. And we want to not have, there's a balance between, like, do you average all the benefits to society to each person? Like if 99% of people in society were to have a better quality of life in some way, but then you had to like torture and kill 1%, like where's the trade-off of that? Like, and it's ultimately I think it's a game that you can't win. I think it's a game that, like, unless you had God on the board of directors to tell you what the answer is, which would make the game not worth playing in the first place. Like, the whole existence of life is game theory. It's like there's no winning game theory. There's no like, oh, I figured it out. What would you do? It's like, you beat the game. What do you do when you beat the game? You turn the game off. You're done playing the video game. It's like, so I don't know. I tend to think that there's always going to be times of like, oh, this is amazing. We figured it out. We struck gold, right? Like, crypto is kind of in that phase now, and has been, and I think will continue to be for a few years. And then it'll be like, oh, this sucks. This is really bad. And then we're going to be like, oh, wait, I got an idea. And then it like morphs and shifts into a new direction. Here's a new thing. Because I think, like, what is it, even a public good, when you say a public good, I think you mean one of two things, and tell me if you can elaborate on it. But you mean either that it's just become something of the past that's useful, like HTTP, some protocol on the internet. It's not really changing. It's useful. It's a public good. It's great. It exists, like telephone poles or telephone wires. It's like, we're not changing them. Or it means something like something that's living and breathing and growing and adding value continuously. And if it's of the latter, then it has to make decisions about which way to go, where to deploy resources. And if it makes decisions, then you're caught up in the same game as every other group of human beings working on something. Right?
Right. So when I say public good, I mean, when I say public good, I mean something that is part of the commons. It is something where the net utility that gets distributed to every person that is interacting with the system, it's like equally accessible to all, and the net utility that gets distributed to everybody interacting within the system is the cost of that is also borne by everybody. So it's not like exploitative, where like a certain subset of people is paying the cost for a larger group of people benefiting, or a situation where a large group of people are paying the cost and a small group of people are benefiting. And so examples of public goods, I mean, there's of course like a lot of things that people think of when they think of public goods, like roads and bridges. But what I'm particularly interested in is like, again, like I think institutions are historically throughout human history have been a problem. And so what I'm interested in is building public goods that are not controlled by corporations and that are not controlled by governments. And I think the best example that we have of this today is the internet. I think the internet would governments have wanted the internet to exist if it was created today? No, absolutely not. Right, because it stands for a push towards an opening of information and an opening of like coordination that is fundamentally antithetical to the incentives of any single organization, because any single organization benefits more from controlling information. Again, Wardley method, right? You benefit from this like basically not letting these things become utilities. But at the same time, like when you create these kind of like the internet itself, obviously there's negative things that have come out of it. Of course, there are so many negative things that have come out of it. But on the whole, it has massively improved human life, massively. And a big part of the reason why that's happened is that it's been a net equalizing force, right? No matter how much money you have, the internet doesn't confer any benefits to you specifically as an individual, right? Like you may be able to do more things on it, you may be able to buy more things on it, but like the internet doesn't give a shit about who you are. It doesn't care about where you are. Like people who are living in Southeast Asia, right, where there's like 80+% like smartphone penetration, and are using internet on their smartphones every day, are like accessing this ecosystem and this world and benefiting from it to the same extent as people anywhere else. And in fact, I would say almost even more so, because in many cases they wouldn't have had access. A lot of people wouldn't have had access to those resources otherwise. So it's like we've seen this like global shift in the world towards democracy, towards like freedom of speech, towards like better human rights, and all of it has been driven like better, more egalitarian governments, right? Like the Arab Spring happened because of the internet. Like what is happening in Ukraine and Russia right now is happening because of the internet. Everything that happened in Hong Kong and with like China, like the fact that we even know that happened is because of the internet. It's this like enormously powerful tool for human beings to learn more about the world in a fair way. And I want to create more of that. I think there are a lot of other things that should be fundamental human rights, and it shouldn't matter. Like you should be able to hedge against the fact that your government may elect a dictator. Right? You should be able to help. It's like there are like I'm not American, even though I have an American accent. I grew up in the Middle East. I grew up like I'm an Indian citizen. I have been all over the world. I have had friends from all over the world. And I think that's helped me get this perspective of like, even in countries that seem really fine, things change politically. When they change politically, like you can suddenly get completely fucked. Like you have so many countries in the world that used to be like free, open societies that just ended up through a string of like bad situations, ended up like getting totally fucked. And now they are extremely repressed economies, extremely repressed socially. They don't have access to the same kinds of rights that other people do, but they still have access to the internet. And like, I think there is something fundamentally good about elevating the human experience by making sure that people have access to some inalienable rights.
Yeah.
In today's day and age.
Yeah. I want to tell me if you disagree with my definition of the words that you're using. So when I think of the word internet and I think of the word government, I think you mean just opposite ends of the spectrum of power. So the internet represents a completely equal access of power. And by power, I just mean connection to each other, because the internet's not a thing. It's not like we can go to this place. The internet only exists in reference to what's not the internet, which is no computers and no ability to connect. So you and I were like on the internet, but I'm just in my chair in my room looking at this screen. So the internet is just it's like your example earlier. It's the agreement to run information through lines, just like a road. You know, like if roads exist, that's a network of roads. You can call it like a car net, right? Like the car net exists. I love the car net. I can go down to a grocery store. We talk about how great the car net is, but it's like, it's really just a pathway of information. And I think if what you're saying about Connext happens, that would mean that there's like the Connext, am I saying this right? Connects. Wait, Connext is the pathway between blockchains. So there's all these independent blockchains which represent places people want to go. And it's like, well, how do I get from here to there? Well, you take the Connext superhighway, and that to me it feels like a good definition of public good. I think intrinsic in the definition of public good is that it doesn't really move beyond. It has a goal and an end zone, and it accomplishes that, and then innovation doesn't need to continue. Like like in the internet, there's not the same with the car net or the roads. Yes. Like roads are kind of they maintained, right? We like fix potholes, but we're not building faster asphalt or things. Like we might run faster wires to connect throughput, but like we're just going to get to the point where it's like maximum internet potential. That's the goal of the utility companies that are currently building.
Well, that's the thing though. Yeah. Well, I mean, that's the thing though, is like, it's like, there isn't, so obviously there is no key stakeholder group behind the internet, right? There's so many different people that are involved in making it a reality, and it is truly a commons. I mean, there's centralization that is happening behind, cloud computing resources and stuff like that, but it is a commons in the sense that like the people working on the internet are like foundations, like, like organizations like Mozilla, centralized corporations like Cloudflare and Google. And then you have like ICANN and other like completely esoteric, like, acronym named foundations that most people don't know about, and then like random research groups in the middle of nowhere that are doing things. And it is being worked on, right? Like we have upgrades to all of the protocols. I mean, we're still rolling out the IPv6 upgrade that has been rolled out for the last like 10 years or whatever, because it just takes a really long time to roll these things out. But we're rolling out 5G internet now. We're rolling out like a lot of these other kinds of things that are basically upgrades to the system that allow it to perform better at the thing that is performing. But because the internet is a commons, we're not doing the Amazon thing, which is, we've built this really, really great marketplace. Okay, let's leverage that to go and build grocery stores, right? It's not like people on the internet are like, we've built this really great communication network. Now let's leverage that to like go. Well, arguably, it is kind of what's happening, actually, if you think about what's happening with blockchains, right? We are leveraging the internet to go and now take over money and take over finance and take over government.
Yeah.
So in a way, it is kind of actually happening if you think about it. I think the difference is just that it's not like you're not doing it in an extractive way. And I think that's what matters. It's like the core goal of the internet is not to make a bunch of people make money from being on the internet, and so that's why it's like worth coordinating around. But like the goal is not just let's make a bunch of people money, and for some core set of stakeholders, that's the only reason that they're involved in the first place.
But would you agree that just about? I mean, when I think of Mozilla, who creates Firefox, whose 99% of the revenue comes from Google, which comes from advertising. So it's like, okay, consumers are driving that engine, and purchasing power is capitalism. And then the utilities, like when I think of pay my electric bill, like PG&E or any utility, Starlink that provides internet, they're pretty competitive and they want to make money. Verizon, AT&T, like they're competing and buying each other, and they have all the same capitalist incentives. So there's the internet, which is this benevolent kind of abstract idea, but then there's all these participators that make the internet a thing that exists. And it's like blockchain exists, but then it's like, well, the people, I'm sure that the people on every project, like Solana and Ethereum, whoever owns those currencies wants that to go up. So they're working, telling their boyfriend or their girlfriend, hey, like we're doing this deploy, and like it's going to be great. We're going to take over market share, and we're going to grow the token and buy that car you wanted or whatever. And like it does. I mean, people can volunteer if people are fortunate enough to have made enough money in their life that they have enough what they want, they can give back. But I think like we're always constrained by the system that seeks to keep track of how much value you're adding to society. Like if the trap on the other side of the spectrum, like people who criticize capitalism, the trap on the other side of like not having that scorecard for value is that we don't know how to track value. So people run in directions that are not useful. It's like people aren't doing anything productive. Yeah. And then the price of that is pretty bad. So yeah.
This is something that you see at like nonprofits.
Yeah. Right.
Example, right. Like there's no, there's, a lot of people are like, oh, well, corporations are really bad because like they're extracting value from users and they're extracting value from employees and stuff like that. But if you look at like the way that nonprofits operate and like the kind of cost to benefit ratio of them, it's atrocious. Yeah. Like nonprofits raise an assload of capital, and then the problem is that they're not beholden to anybody. As a nonprofit, you don't as a corporation, if you don't find product market fit, and if you don't actually generate some sort of utility for somebody, you have to be benefiting somebody. You might be extracting value from a lot of other people. You might be doing it in a really shitty way. And unfortunately, the incentives right now are in many cases that you're doing it in a shitty way. But if you're not benefiting someone, you're going to die, because ultimately that's the core thesis of a corporation. In a nonprofit, that's not the case, right? Like as a nonprofit, there's no your longevity is not contingent for most nonprofits and most successful nonprofits. Your longevity is not contingent upon whether or not you actually successfully deploy the capital that you raised. It's just contingent on how much more capital you can raise in the future based on your brand and based on your fundraising capability. Yeah. And so, there is a reason why a lot of leaders at nonprofits are paid an absurd amount of money. There is a reason why, they're like a very, very significant amount of money from nonprofits gets like laundered or doesn't actually end up going where it's supposed to go. Like you give money to a lot of organizations that are supposed to be deploying it in, places in sub-Saharan Africa. And I mean, there's so many statistics that show like, oh, well, only like less than 20 cents of every dollar that you send actually goes to anywhere even close to those ecosystems. And it's because you just have a lot of people along the way being like, oh, well, I'm absolutely going to use this to line my pockets to do a bunch of stuff.
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, it's like, these are, it might be in my, I don't like there is a certain futility to human growth.
I think that's what we've
I think this is definitely like a problem.
Yeah.
But I do think that you can get better at it. Like, I think that like, this is sort of the goal of the space. Like one thing that I've observed is like, what you almost want to do is you can create like public goods. You can create these sort of like interestingly cooperative, almost like socialized systems by producing almost perfect competition. And a really good example of this is blockchain nodes. So if you have a bunch of people running nodes in a blockchain, they are in perfectly elastic competition with one another, right? The benefits that some of them have versus others. Now, of course, there's some mechanisms, like there's things like economies of scale and stuff like that you have to worry about around the technology. And these are things that need to be worked on and that people are working on. But the core thesis is that you are always earning a proportional share of the revenue of the network compared to the amount of work or stake that you're putting in. And so there is no monopolizing, right? Like fundamentally it's not possible to monopolize. And also your incentive is not to monopolize, because you sort of all want to always be locked into this perfect competition with each other. Your incentive is to try to gain as much market share as you can. But if you gain too much market share, you're now decreasing the value of the entire ecosystem.
Right.
And because you're locked in this perfect competition with each other, with all of the other stakers, you're now actually incentivized to collaborate on the system that you're building on. Because anything that you can do now to decrease your marginal costs, which can be borne collectively by everybody, anything that you can do to kind of bring those costs down benefits everyone, and also specifically benefits your own business and benefits your own margins. And I've noticed that this is a pattern that you can actually copy paste to a bunch of other places as well, that is quite interesting. Now you have to be careful, because it's like, you also don't want to create a race. You want to create perfect competition without creating a race to the bottom, because if you have a race to the bottom, that's also bad. If you have a race to the bottom, what ends up happening is people keep undercutting on fees. eventually you just get somebody with big enough pockets who comes and charges zero, and then they price everybody out, and then they raise the prices, which happens all the time. So you have to find some way to enforce, make basically peer enforcement. Again, the only reliable mechanism that we've ever developed to do this is the blockchain. But that you sort of need some sort of like peer enforcement to make sure that people are charging the same fees as each other, and they're not like trying to exploit or sort of manipulate the like core economics of the system.
I love that. I love what you said. To me, I see. I mean, as you're describing it, I can see it in parallel to what we have in the traditional system, though. Like, tell me where this doesn't line up for you. Is that so? Take the case of like attention, the attention marketplace. Like Facebook has been dominant player in that. TikTok is in there. Many other companies play in that space and monetize off that through advertising. Hugely valuable. It's like it's driven a lot of the economy and many different products and services. There is a concern centrally by the government, which is just a reflection of the shareholders or the token holders, the citizens of that country, that if any particular company gets too much of a market share of the attention economy, then we call that a monopoly and we get really concerned about that. And so there's a lot of concern politically about the monopolies effect of, the big tech like Facebook, and they've been subpoenaed and all that. And that has been, to me, a very parallel equilibrium or equalizing force to what you described in the mining world. Like if one node had all the mining capacity, well, we would be very concerned as members of the token holders. And so we would either leave and like sell off and the price would drop and this node would effectively be losing market share. So it's within the node's self-interest to have other competitors, but to have very few, to maybe have like two. And so you end up with this polarization, which I think is the same principle of the universe as what creates the polarization politically. It's like we have two large political parties that have enough power to push the other one, but not push the other one over. Because if they push the other one over all the way, then the system gets incredibly unstable. And then it explodes and like a revolution happens. Or in the case of Bitcoin or blockchain, then everyone leaves and there's like, they go put their money in other currencies. And I think that would happen whether it's almost just like it's like a fact. It feels like a fact of the universe. It's like Pareto's principle means that things consolidate to the point where they're hyper consolidated and there's only one, and then it explodes and it's like there's it's like it's the universe itself, right? It's like it kind of represents that pattern of like the Big Bang. It's chaos. It's everywhere. It condenses, like all the stars condense together and solar systems condense and matter condenses, and then it blows up again. I wonder I don't know, man. That's super interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I do think it's a little bit different in the sense that, like, so the big difference that I would say between those two systems, which are like blockchains and like blockchain nodes versus what is existing with like traditional corporations that are monopolizing, is that like in blockchain nodes, I would say that it's actually most likely going to be a lot more than 2 to 3, because like I think you can. I mean, the goal is to avoid that kind of long tail distribution, right? Because if you end up in that kind of distribution of power and like distribution of like mining power or staking power in these networks, then that's objectively quite bad for the network, because you've taken this thing that is like a public good and you've turned it into like a small conglomerate of corporations. And so I think like in those cases, the incentives are not to do that, because like people will just move to a different chain eventually. For like eventually this thing will just hit the same sort of issues with like centralization that exists in the world today. But I think the other big difference is that with traditional corporations, like you don't actually have that kind of perfect competition, because what ends up happening is we have governments that can be lobbied, right? And so governments don't end up actually slapping these companies like on the wrist. They don't end up doing anything to regulate these companies. They end up just like either not doing anything or actively supporting them. Like you have companies like Amazon aggressively lobbying to make it to have governments create regulations that make it so that they can be the only player, so that they can shut out new entrants to the market, so that they maintain their monopoly forever. And that's something that I think like fundamentally is what I would like to avoid in our space. Is like, this is one of the problems with governance. I mean, I think governance overall is just really bad. I think human beings are really bad at coordinating around things. And like, I think that like, especially when it comes to governance, like it's just so easy to like bribery and governance is something that is never going to be able to be stopped. And like, so the less you're able to govern, the better, in the sense that like when you leave things open to the public to decide, oh, do we do like this large range of activities, the likelihood that bribing occurs is just exponentially increased. And I think that that's, you know, something that like I would hope that, you know, we can try to avoid in our ecosystem, is try to create like, you know, this is definitely a problem with DAOs today, but try to create systems that like don't need to have as many levers, that aren't as susceptible to somebody with a lot of money coming in and just saying, I'm going to buy this entire ecosystem.
It almost seems like
influence.
It almost seems like I see now how what you said earlier about the crypto world just going through the same tripwires as was in the traditional world, just at light speed. It's like, well, okay, here's what's going on, is that you have this, you have a competition across miners who can provide mining power. And here's the key factor though. The person who's winning is more likely to win in the future because they gain resources that allow them to invest in computational power, exactly, centralization. So it's like it's like, you know, a sports team. As a sports team wins, they're recruiting more people and better players. And those better players want to, you know, the best players out of high school want to come there. And then it kind of snowballs. And like, look what happened in the Bitcoin mining world. Like it used to be, you could mine Bitcoin on your laptop and your computer in your room. And now it's like massive warehouses and publicly traded companies that are like, I don't know how many, the distribution, like the pie graph is like 12 major players. And then
have to be in like Greenland or something.
And it's like, what the market really wants is efficient mining. That's what the market wants. And all you need, the way that you optimize efficient mining is you have a competitive landscape. So you have to have at least two. If you have one, there's no competition. They can charge whatever they want. But if you have two and you have complete freedom to move between them, like extremely low switching costs, which there are, then they keep each other in check. It's like the fact that there's two, they're only going to drop as low as they can. And so that race to the bottom happens. It's like, I don't see how how does that not happen? Like, how do we not end up with a situation that is, as long as the mining space is hyper efficient and there's no barriers or regulations, which there's not, then it just seems like it just ends at two. I mean, they just eat each other and eat each other.
So I think what you have to stop, what you basically have to stop is sort of like it's true that it is always, I think there is no possible way to stop the idea that if you have more capital, you're going to be able to get more capital. That's just, there's no way to stop that, I think. I think what you can stop is the multiplicative effects of that, where you are able to then leverage that capital to like create even bigger compounding unfairness in a system that then makes it so that you can like monopolize further and further and further. And that's different. I mean, I think that one is easier because in that you can do by making sure that the system's rules are like fundamentally set in a way that can be changed without like really much more complex coordination and things like that. But yeah, I think the first case of like, you can't stop I think this is, and it's not, you might not even want to stop it, right? Like this kind of goes back to what we were saying earlier, where you have this like progress of evolution, where things kind of compound on top of each other and like they continue building on top of each other. And this is how like human society has evolved. This is how, you know, evolution has happened. This is how knowledge works at a fundamental level. It seems like that compounding action is also just like a fundamental piece of nature. And it's unclear whether you would want that to stop, because I think if you had that stop, then the incentive, I think a lot of the incentives to do things also kind of disappear. But it is a really difficult question. These are exactly the sorts of questions that we need to be asking, because they're like, these are questions that like about society and economics that people have asked for a really long time, but this is the first time we ever have a chance to like do something about it that is meaningful, right? This is the first time we can build systems, like we can run experiments on it that can scale, and we can run hundreds and hundreds of experiments on this in a year rather than like, one grand experiment because we built a large empire over the course of 100 years. And so it's like, my bet is there are probably solutions to this stuff. Those solutions will have trade-offs, and as a society we'll have to kind of consider what those trade-offs are and whether those trade-offs are worthwhile. But there are probably better, like we won't have like a perfect solution to anything, but I think we'll probably be able to like improve. We will be able to at least stop what's happening right now, which is the massive acceleration of inequality. The rate at which, like, obviously at an absolute level, all human beings' lives have massively improved compared to even 100 years ago. The average human being's lives is massively improved. Even the worst human being in the worst possible conditions today is doing better than many human beings were doing 500 years ago. However, the gap between like the top and the bottom, while it got better for some time, has now gone back to where it was in feudal era, where you had wealthy kings and queens and royalty and then serfs. And like that difference is at the same place that it was back then. And that is definitely the problem to fix now. You won't be able to completely fix it, but at least making it so that there's like, it's more reasonable is the goal.
I see it as a one-way street that just keeps going in circles, but I mean, if you take wealth from people that are on the top end of the 1%, so to speak, then you're slowing the progress there, but you're reducing the overall, like hypothetically, for everyone to have the same starting point in society, you have to take away everyone's money, and you end up in this like, I mean, that's the theory of communism, is that we all are equal, and by definition, we're not incentivized to the incentive to work comes from the incentive to generate return on that investment of time and energy. And that the reason you want to do that is so you have an accumulation of wealth that you can spend. And if you take away that engine, it's like now you have a centralized distribution of currency. Like the government gives everyone the same, or they dictate what you earn. And then you like, this is the problem with this side of the governance spectrum, is that people who are not being compensated for their efforts decrease their efforts. Like, so everyone's half-assing the job, like, government workers on the job that have no incentive to work harder. Like
I think that's kind of silly too. Like I think like there are a lot of really important things. So I tend to fall into like the social anarchist camp, which is like, if you have like your traditional political compass where you sort of have like, left right is like, capitalism on like full laissez-faire, like libertarian capitalism on one side, and then like full sort of like basically like opposite end of the spectrum is like full communism, and then top and bottom is like, left is capitalism, right is communism, and top and bottom is like, bottom is libertarian and top is authoritarian. And I think a lot of like when people think about like communism, they think of sort of like authoritarian communism, like Leninism and stuff like that. And then I think when a lot of people think about like capitalism, they think like totally free market capitalism, which is like, bottom corner, other end of the spectrum. And I think that like there is a largely like there are like a lot of like the reality of society is actually just in a box. It's like right in the middle. Almost the entirety of society is just like right in the center area right now. There I think is a lot of really interesting stuff that happens. It's not a full solution. There's a lot of really interesting stuff that happens where you don't have authoritarianism like traditional communist governments, because again, authoritarianism is institutions, and I hate institutions. ideally to think that institutions are bad, but you have like individual property and individual rights, but you do have socialism in the sense that you understand that you basically like attribute value to public goods. You attribute value to like things that are part of the commons, and you say that the mechanism by which people can produce value itself needs to be part of the commons, right? It's not owned by a private company; it's owned by individuals. And I think that there's something interesting there. I mean, the reason that social anarchism has always been thrown out in the past was like, how do you enforce it, right? Like you're basically telling people, oh, your small group of 100 people are going to govern yourselves. So how are you going to enforce that? And you know, a long time ago, that was able to be enforced just through peer enforcement. But I think like because of the way that the world works now, it's a lot harder. But blockchains might give us a way out of that. Where it's like now you can enforce it using some on-chain mechanism that everybody has agreed to beforehand and is buying into. And now the cost of enforcement is almost nothing. So you can have lots and lots and lots of small 100-person groups. And instead of requiring, 10 million people to vote on something, you can actually just have 100,000 100-person groups that are all doing small niche specific things that are coordinating each other in more of a swarm way. And I think that's interesting. It might not be the full solution. I think that there are certainly problems associated still with like, I don't think like the abolishment of capital itself is realistic at all. Like it doesn't make any sense. But I also don't think that like markets and capital itself is capitalism, right? Like I think there is a lot of modern socialist, socio-anarchic literature that argues that markets are actually fundamentally not capitalism. Capitalism is like the exploitative ownership of the market itself. But if the market is the public good, then it's fine. And that's actually itself more communist because now people are owning the means by which they're like the means by which you are able to generate value is owned by the public. But yeah, it's a really interesting question, and of course, like it gets into a lot of this like really deep theoretical stuff around political science and philosophy that is interesting and not always very useful.
Yeah. It's like, I think it may not be useful, but it's valuable to know. It's valuable to build coherent arguments on top of. It's like, why is philosophy useful? Well, it's useful because it's the bedrock of every other opinion you have. It's like, well, abortion or gun rights or immigration. It's like these political debates get thrown around. And frankly, some of them, like whatever team you're on, left or right, they don't, what's the guiding philosophy or principle behind this team? And that I think it's like weak bedrock right now. Like there's not enough philosophical conversations. There's too many practical conversations, and those practical conversations don't have anything to latch onto. And so they're like, you get politicians like saying just clearly lambosted ideas. It's like, that unless you,
or like
exactly.
Of like, oh, that is socialism.
Right.
Everyone is claiming to each other, no, that's socialism. Or, no, that's communism. But like, it's like, no, none of these things are any of these things at all. Actually, these are all again in this very, very small box of things. It's like right in the middle of the political compass, and none of these things are actually very that like radical in any way.
Yeah. And are you proposing? Would you consider it a radical change? What you'd like to see, or what you think we should move towards? Or is it a slight change?
Yeah, I think so. So I guess like one thing, you touched upon like the two-party American political system, and we're starting to see that in a lot of other places. I think a part of the reason that exists is because we have this like binary option vote. So you end up in a yes/no situation because you can only say yes or no. So you end up in a situation where you have two options because you have to say yes or no to one or the other. If you had better voting mechanisms, like I think a part of the problem is that like governance and the concept of voting can really be broken down into information theory, which is like, how are you going to how are you in the most efficient way possible going to collect the sentiment of the correct people across the country that are able to opine on a given topic without burning them out because they're voting constantly, or without ending up in the situation like you have currently, where you're just having people be single issue voters. And it's a really difficult question, and I think the answer is just like, don't have everybody vote on everything. Like, I don't think that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Don't have like large scale institutions. It doesn't work.
Yeah. Well,
but at the same time, I do think
I was going to add one point to that. It seems like one flaw I've observed during COVID is that in the medical profession, it's nothing unique about the medical profession. My wife is a doctor, and she will talk about this on the inside. Is like, there's a lot, like what's being portrayed as like mainstream consensus medical opinion is not a representation of an authentic trust vote happening across doctors. It's like there's I use the word like political pressure, but ultimately it's like, hey, the corporation that you're employed at, this hospital system, wants to make money, and if you don't abide by what we say, then we're more likely to fire you. And so you step in line. And the same thing is true for academic research and science. And so this is where I think,
or if they're the CEO of a publicly traded corporation.
Totally. It's like, well, the story I want to believe is the one that makes me more money. And that's the trap. Is like, when people say trust the science, what they're really saying is like, trust what the for-profit organizations are saying, using one pathway of the scientific method that is somehow biased. Like, it's in order to have the most authentic form of scientific research, the outcomes of what you discover have to be completely detached from the funding mechanism. Like, if a vaccine company, if Pfizer is paying researchers to do research and they say, well, hey, if you don't get what we want, we're not going to fund you anymore. It's like, well, no surprise where that goes. Now, that doesn't mean that they don't generate authentic results. And that's largely where the political waters meet, is like, how authentic are these? And people debate this all day. But that's at least bringing to awareness what the incentives are, the problems with the incentives.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I think like your kind of original question around this was like, does there need to be radical change? I think increasingly, yes. Like, and it's not that I'm suggesting that there needs to be, a revolution. What I'm saying is that is inevitable, unless there is radical change. So like, we talked a little bit about like the rise and fall of empires. We talked a little bit about like, is there a way to potentially break out of that cycle in this case? Is there a way to avoid the like inevitable, like, it's like we will get to the point. We will, if things continue on the path that they are continuing on, we will get to the eat the rich point. and the guillotine point. And I think that's like that's like sort of the tipping point where like, that society collapses and then another battle starts. I would like, that may be necessary. It may be the only option, but what I would like to do also is, if there is a way to make things better without doing that, that would be great too, because the negative externalities of revolution, while revolutions are often very glorified, and like people are always like, oh my God, French Revolution, like the rise of democracy in France. And it was the overthrowing of this really, really shitty system. But if there was actually a way to do that without the massive negative externalities that happen as a result of it, that would have been great. Right? Like the same kind of revolution happened in India without a bunch of people dying.
Yeah, it feels like the evolutionary part of where we are today versus then was that the consolidation of power in the times you're referring to, like the French Revolution, was that it was governmental consolidation of power, and it was also an arrogance. So you sprinkle like centralization of governmental power, which is given to the government either from the threat of violence to people or voluntarily by a constitution, and then also arrogance on top of that, saying you can't ever take it away from us. Now, if you look at the two things, those two things are different today. The people who have consolidated power have done so through the capitalistic system. They've, like Elon, right? He's worked really hard. He's built an incredible amount of value, and you can't deny that. And so you're left with this situation of like, okay, he's done good stuff to people give him money, right? He didn't take any money from anybody. And also, you said earlier, you don't know whether Zuckerberg's a good person or not. It's like the people who seem to be running these large companies, they're either faking it really well or they're convincing me that they're generally hardworking, thoughtful people who want good in the world. And so I don't look at Elon and think, oh, he's arrogant. He just wants as much money as possible. And I don't feel that way about Zuckerberg either. Like, I think they have genuine good intentions. And so I'm not liable to, I don't see a world where like we cut off Warren Buffett's head and say, you're a bad, like, it doesn't seem like that. They don't have that attitude. And so that, I think that's the trick, or that's the puzzle that we're in. It's like, what do you do with that? You know, you've gotten this means through good intent. You know, people have given you all this money because you worked really hard.
Maybe. I think there are a lot of people that disagree.
Tell me.
And that's the thing. Like, there are a lot of people that don't like
oh, sure.
Musk, don't like Zuckerberg, don't like. I mean, I would say, like, you know, our interpretation of it is much more charitable than the majority of people.
What do you think is the
especially outside of,
what's the best steelman argument on that side of the table? Because I don't hear enough of that, frankly. Like, what's the best criticism of Zuck and Elon? And
I mean, there's so much. I mean, I think, see, again, it's like in many cases, a lot of this stuff is like not. It's interesting because it's like, on the one hand, it is totally valid. But on the other hand, it's like, I think it's naive to assume that it's the person and not just the system, right? And like my sort of philosophy on this stuff is like, it's not, I don't blame Elon for being really wealthy. I do think he's actually doing some good stuff. He is an asshole. Don't get me wrong. He is absolutely an asshole. I know, like, my co-founder worked for him. I know plenty of people who currently work for him, and they all agree that he's a huge asshole and that he's an unreasonable person and that he creates generally incredibly terrible working conditions. And he has done a lot of really shady shit, as have most people with a lot of wealth, because everybody does shady shit sometimes. And like, when you have a lot of money, that's just magnified significantly. True. But I also think it's not his fault that the world is in this place. I think we just have a system that produces billionaires. We have a broken system that creates the right incentive mechanisms for some people to end up in this position, and then for some subset of those people to abuse that position, and an increasing incentive for a larger number of them to abuse that position, because if they don't abuse that position, they fall out of that position. And so then it's sort of like the like survivorship bias, where you're just like, you see the ones that are succeeding because, and the ones like the sort of philosophy of like, okay, well, these are the worst, like, these people are causing the problems or whatever, is because like they are the ones who have actually just like lasted this long. And it's unclear whether they've lasted this long because they've had to compromise on their ethics, or it's because they just like kind of lucked into it and they're eventually going to have to compromise on their ethics or something. But we are in a system that does make you compromise on a lot of things to maintain that level of wealth. And some people are more willing to do it than others. I don't intrinsically think that there is anything immoral about being extremely wealthy. I do think morally you're obligated to do things that are better for the world because of it. And I think that if you are a person that succeeds to that level, you actually need to be held to a higher standard than other people. Not the same standard, a much higher standard. And that's difficult. It is, like, but like, I sort of believe in this idea of like, if you have privilege, you're morally obligated to do something with it. If you are a person that has grown up in a situation where like you can help people and you don't help people, then you're not using your position for good, and that's actually a bad thing. Like, doing nothing in the face of evil.
Yeah, if the word morality means anything, it means that. It means when you can do something. Yeah. Right. There's a spectrum of morality, right? Like, how much of a cost do I have to pay to benefit somebody else? And the farther you go down that low cost, high benefit, the more moral obligation people have, right? It's like, if we want anything, we want the flourishing of as many people as possible. Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, it's a really, really interesting. I mean, this has been a really interesting conversation because we've been able to touch on so many different aspects of like society, economics, governance, and like generally a thesis of how all these things fit together, and how that ties into crypto overall. And I think that's so important because there's a lot of a lot of people who are in the space, especially a lot of people that have joined over the course of the last couple of years when we've been in a bull market, have not really had the opportunity to understand like what is the ethos that is driving this stuff, right? It's like there is still a core group of like, I would say probably less than a few thousand people in the space that are the ones who really have been here for a while and are just never going to leave, and who truly like their goal is like, even if many of them have made a lot of capital, they're not the people that are going and buying things, right? They're the people that are still living in little houses, like spending 100% of their time working on trying to figure out how to make the world actually better, like trying to figure out how to solve this incredibly difficult problem that like we've all been banging our heads against for a while. And that this problem of like, how can we build things that remain good, that can't be evil, and they can't become evil at some point in the future because of outside.
Yeah, and evil is like, yeah. I mean, really, that's the synthesis of what it's about, right? Is like, how do you minimize? Yeah. I think of it as like, how do you minimize the potential impact that evil tendencies are likely to have on a system, while knowing that to try to extinguish evil is a fool's errand and will only result in chaos and widespread evil. It's like, that's the thing. It's like, you have to, a system that's corrupt is a good system as long as the corruption is at a minimum level. And it's like, you know that there's you always got to pay those gas fees, man. It's like, you can't operate with a utopian mindset.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's basically it. It's like, you can't, it's not the people, I fundamentally don't think people, I think it's extraordinarily rare to actually have intrinsically evil people. I think people always believe they're doing the right thing. They might have the most convoluted possible mechanism for believing they're doing the right thing, and to everybody else, it might immediately be very, very apparent that they are doing something that is fundamentally evil. But I think really, in many of these cases, it's not the people, it's the systems. It's not, it's Hanlon's razor.
No, it sounds familiar.
Occam's
razor.
So Occam's razor is, of course, like, in any, if you have a set of different things, like different solutions to a problem, the one that is the most likely solution is the simplest one. It's just basically simplicity always wins. Hanlon's razor is about incentives, and Hanlon's razor is never attribute to malice what you can attribute to incentives, and never attribute to incentives what you could attribute to stupidity.
I like that.
Yeah.
I like that a lot. Yeah, that seems to that resonates with me. Yeah. Yeah, it seems like there's a incredible potential, man, of this technology to reorganize the way that we compensate people, pay people, allow people to contribute their ideas, and through voting. And so much of the ecosystem seems to be about making money. The vast majority of it is speculation dollars, which it's like, I'm so slow to label things as good or bad. It's like, I don't know. You ever hear this? This is a good proverb. You ever heard of Alan Watts? Yeah, he is. Yeah, he's great.
I love him. It's fantastic.
It's like, he reminds me of the proverb that says, there's a farmer and he's out in his farm with his son, and his son is riding a horse and falls off the horse and breaks his leg. And they go into the town at night and there's like, "Oh, that's so bad that you broke your leg. I'm so sorry." And he says, "Oh, no, that's, maybe," is his response. And he gets, the next day, the government comes around, conscription, and they're recruiting people to join the military, and he doesn't have to serve because he broke his leg. And they're like, "Oh, that's so great that you don't have to serve." And he's like, "Well, maybe." And it's like, just keeps going on like that. Yeah. Well, I know we're pushing the over 2 hour mark. I know it's late where you are. But yeah.
Wow.
Are there places, people in particular, that have inspired you to think deeply? I know you went to school for philosophy, I believe, or physics and philosophy. So I was excited to get into this conversation in the first place, seeing that. Who have you learned the most or feel inspired by the most?
That's a really good question. When I was young, I don't know why this happened, but when I was young, I went through a very, very aggressive political philosophy phase. So I spent a lot of time reading a lot of political theory, and a lot of, Kant, a lot of like Rawls, trying to understand the concepts of equality and justice. I would say those things are obviously quite like heavy. But I think that there is some like interesting modern philosophy around this stuff, around ethics, that is being done by Alice Crowley, for instance, and like there's a whole branch of like ethics and ethical judgment and ethics in society associated with Wittgenstein, which is really interesting. I think other than that, in like a more modern sense, I think something that really just like woke me up to some of the ways of thinking about innovation in society was the blog Wait But Why, which is really much more approachable for most people than really deep philosophy. But then from there, reading about how we actually know the things that we know, like the whole process of epistemology, which is the field of understanding knowledge, was very eye opening. And yeah, I think like those are a lot of the like key influences for me to go down this path. The other thing that was like really influential was that I was just like, I just fortuitously happened to be very heavily involved in the IRC communities as like one of the first sort of social experiences that I had on the internet. And like a lot of the IRC communities that I was involved with were also like deeply involved in peer-to-peer file sharing. So there was a lot of the things that actually were the things that led to crypto being created were the discussions that were happening in those places. And it was really, really interesting to hear about why information should be open and why it wants to be free, and like why we should try to live in a world where like you can have universal public access to different kinds of resources. At least, I would say ethically and sort of like motivation wise, these are the things that kind of have led me to.
Are you a big Aaron Swartz fan?
Yeah, I am.
Yeah.
I didn't learn about him until like a lot later than I think most people, just because I was outside of the US and it wasn't really talked about outside of the US as much. That was also in the period of time when I was like had a little bit of a separation from that whole community for like 5 years or so, just because I actually missed all of Bitcoin because of this. Really, really bad thing to miss, but I did like, I am a huge fan of Aaron Swartz. I think what happened to him is one of the most awful tragedies, and I still am super frustrated.
Yeah, it's definitely motivating. I mean, when someone gives their life to something like that, it's like it cements home how important it is. Last question for you: do you ever follow or read any of the Eastern philosophy? Get into any Buddhism or Hinduism or the Vedantas or any of the yogic practices? I noticed you have I was going to say, do you have an Indian tattoo on your arm?
Yeah, the tattoo. Yeah, I'm actually Indian ethnically. My parents are Indians. I mean, I'm Indian as well, technically. Like, I have a Indian passport. I just grew up in the UAE, and my parents are Hindus. Not super religious. I think like generally, I mean, I've been very blessed to have extremely like open-minded parents who have always been very like international. I've lived in an extremely multicultural environment, which helped a lot. But I did have a lot of exposure to Hinduism, and then through that Buddhism, because they're so closely related in so many ways, from a very early age. And I think that has shaped a lot of the way that I think about things. It's like I'm a very, very strong anti-materialist. I remember there was a point in my life where for a long time, I maintained only, for a long time, I was really anal about this, and I had less than 300 possessions. That included like pencils and pens, and everything that I owned, less than 300 things. And then, I mean, I've certainly relaxed that quite a bit, but I still largely live out of a one carry-on suitcase that I take on a plane, and I'm fairly nomadic. I don't like, I do think that, I do subscribe to a lot of the like core tenets of Buddhism and of that philosophy. It's not the religious tenets, but at least like the philosophical tenets.
Yeah. There's I feel like there's almost like a accumulation. There's a wisdom potential that I can smell, where if you have an understanding of what ancient religions are espousing, what they're getting after, and what they're getting to, what they're trying to describe and articulate, and then you understand political thinkers, philosophical thinkers, like there's some accumulation of knowledge that's like 1 + 1 is 3. I feel like I'm humbly just starting to accumulate as much as I can and get a perspective as big as I can. But I think that's somehow a part of the breakthrough in consciousness that we can have as people. Is like, and that's, directly in line with what we're talking about, is opening up all the channels for information and then allowing creatives to synthesize it and then put it on a plate in a blog like way about why, so people can understand it. Yeah.
I completely agree. I mean, I think there's like, there are, I mean, this is something that like, it's so astounding because, I studied physics, and it was largely I was very interested in theoretical physics, but it's so astounding the way that the core principles from theoretical physics carry over to so many other things. A lot of the core ways of thinking. And what I'm realizing is that they're actually just like larger patterns in systems and in human thought that over time, as you begin to become an expert in multiple fields simultaneously, you start to see those patterns across different fields. And those fields are not just scientific fields. Like you can see a set of patterns around scientific fields, but you also see larger patterns around like philosophical fields and around like, life philosophies like Buddhism, and then around like other kinds of things like sociological primitives and like economic primitives. It's like, I'm a very intuitive thinker, just by nature. I tend to intuit a lot of answers before I'm able to like analytically express why I understand something or understand a certain pattern. But I do think my intuition, and I still haven't gotten to the point where I truly like am able to like write down a lot of these patterns. But my intuition is that there are basically a set of meta primitives that exist on top of a lot of these things that are fundamental, either rules of the universe or rules of our own brains. And it's unclear which. And those meta primitives, those meta patterns to things are yet to be strictly defined. But once we are able to better define them, once our capacity to learn a lot of things very quickly increases, we will be able to better define them. And I think that'll lead to a better understanding of consciousness and a better understanding of society.
I like that. There's a guy, older guy now, but he's still alive, Ken Wilber, who writes about this in the form of integral theory. So he has this theory of consciousness evolution called integral theory, which is pretty fascinating. It kind of relates to or describes a lot of what you're talking about. Yeah. Where are you? Are you on Twitter? And throw out the best place to learn more about Connext too.
Yes, I'm on Twitter. My Twitter handle is @Arjun Bhuptani. I guess the full name will be somewhere on the podcast, so you'll be able to just find that because the Connext Twitter is @Connext Networks. That's CONNEXT Network. And then our website is connext.network. And then you can also join our Discord, which is where our community hangs out, which is discord.gg/Connext. Definitely keep up to date with what we're doing. I think we're trying to espouse as many of these, like, of course, like, you know, a lot of this has been like highly theoretical talk on this podcast. So we actually really are trying to think about a lot of these problems and trying to like espouse a lot of these core principles around decentralization and trying to genuinely produce better systems for the world. And if you have an interest in it, we'd love to talk.
Sweet, man. I love it. This has been an honor. You're the reason why I do these podcasts. So thank you, sir.
Thank you so much.
Take
really
care.
Appreciate it. Take care.